So Mike Allen and Anand, you all must have been calling each other because your stories that you're here to talk about today are really similar. And Anand, we'll start with you. You're talking about Bernie Sanders going out across America in red districts, talking to Republicans, talking to independents, and talking, listening, but explaining why Republican policies are damaging to their economic future. Tell us about it.
Yeah, and in many ways, it flows very much from the conversation we've been having, which is that this is the recruiting opportunity of a generation to the pro-democracy movement, because it turns out 50-some days in, we are not getting the kind of concerted, intelligent, focused authoritarianism that we've seen at some moments in history in places around the world. We see in some other places in the world now. This is, as Rebecca Solnit said to me yesterday in The Ink, the stupid coup. This is a highly incompetent, awkward, bumbling, chaotic coup. Doesn't mean it's great, but it is actually an opportunity to organize people, because people don't like their stock portfolios diving. People don't like our allies being slapped in the face. People don't like a $2,000 per household tariff tax on Americans. So there's an organizing opportunity. What Bernie Sanders is doing is very interesting, because he's not doing what Bernie Sanders did in 2016, which is simply harangue about the system, the people at the top. He's doing that, but he's starting in a lot of these rallies, as he did in the 2020 campaign, by asking people about their emotional experience of living in this America we're in now. Their stress, their pain. You should watch some of these videos if you haven't. People talk about, I don't know if I should buy myself glasses or my child glasses. How do I prioritize that decision? Think about that. This is America. People are deciding which person needs glasses more, them or their child. They're coming to his rallies. And what he's doing in these rallies that I think a lot of people across the pro-democracy movement could be doing is helping people connect that kind of personal lived experience of pain, stress, angst, connecting it to what is happening in Washington, connecting it to the Trump-Musk coup, connecting it to oligarchy, but not just, as I'm guilty of as much as anybody, not just talking to people about these big forces and structures, rooting it down into, you can't buy those glasses because of these things. You are worried about housing because of these things. I think not a lot of Democrats have been making those connections as well as they could, and I think there's something to watch in that approach.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things, talking about town hall meetings, one of the things I found out like 30 years ago with my first town hall meetings, my first campaign, is Americans just aren't as ideological as we think they are. At the end of the day, it does come down to basics. And even though we see a highly charged debate nationally, and sometimes you'll even see that locally, when people get into the voting booth, they're voting for what they think will help their families, themselves, their jobs, and it's not as ideological. And so, Mike Allen, a fascinating Axios piece about how Democrats are getting out of their bubble. You talk about Gavin Newsom. You talk about Sam Seder. And I love this. 20 supporters against one progressive. And Sam Seder getting like tens of millions of views. Pete Buttigieg going on this Surrounded podcast as well. It seems that, again, they're learning from the mistakes that Democrats have made in the past by not getting out there, getting on Fox News, going on right-wing podcasts. And what's the impact been?
Yeah, Joe, this is something that you have advocated all your career, and that is talk to the other side. You just might learn something. And we find more and more Democrats following that prescription. So in addition to Senator Sanders, who we were just talking about, Tim Walz, the VP candidate, and others going into red districts where Republicans, for the reasons we were talking about at the top of the show, may be hesitant to do town halls. They're going in and doing town halls. You mentioned the Gavin Newsom podcast. And between the lines, what's interesting about these is the approach right now is not combative. They are listening. and they are trying to be conciliatory to the other side. A second window for your viewers, Joe, into how Dems are thinking. A brand new exclusive that just went up on Axios. Third Way, the center-left Democratic think tank, is up with something they're calling the Signal Project, and that is that the issues that make Democratic activists and leaders and donors feel good don't necessarily resonate with the voters that they need. So they say in the Signal Project, they say, ironically, with democracy at risk, the word democracy does not work. What they say is anything that looks performative is either going to be tuned out or backfire. So the issue that they are recommending at the very first, and they're going to do polling and have an 18-month project to look at what works. But the first issue they're looking at, something very real, is risking Americans' safety and security. So it's like the pair of glasses. It's something real, something I can visualize, and hits home.
And Anna, you wrote about the persuaders. You talked about how to impact people, and you also talked about how mistakes that you've made. I've done I think I've done the same thing. I talked about things that matter a great deal to me, but if you talk about democracy, if you talk about the threat of fascism, instead of talking about the price of groceries, the price of gasoline, the price of gases, again, you're talking up here where people are. This is where people live, not in the stratosphere. And talk about the importance. And Bernie Sanders is fascinating because I remember in 2016 seeing a story saying a lot of people that were going to vote for Bernie Sanders ended up voting for Donald Trump. Again, explaining, just like those people who voted for Bobby Kennedy in '68 voting for George Wallace afterwards, explaining a lot of times it doesn't have to do with the sort of partisanship that we think about or the issues that we think about. Talk about the importance, again, of going out, not just talking, but listening. When I was in Congress, I would go on the House floor, and I always sat on the Democratic side, and I just listened and learned.
Yeah, I remember when I was actually covering that Bernie campaign or spring 2019, there were a bunch of guys at these rallies who, if you were just doing like an AI, visual processing of the guy, you'd assume might be a Trump voter. And I would say like 55-year-old guys coming often in factory clothes right out of the factory to a rally, older middle-aged white guys. And so I would get to my question about, well, Bernie's a socialist. And often these guys would be like, oh, I hate socialism, but Bernie's fighting for me. And I think what sometimes we miss is that voters are much more motivated by a visceral sense of fighter for me or not fighter for me, rather than left, right, third way, progressive, whatever. That's background. That's stuff we maybe care about a lot on this show. I think what voters are really actually very smart about is understanding fighter for me or kind of not really.
Yeah, and certainly Bernie Sanders has hit that, but we also know on the other side of the aisle that has been Donald Trump's appeal. Even voters who couldn't be more different than the self-proclaimed billionaire who lives on Fifth Avenue, Joe. That idea of that he stands for them and is willing to fight for them. That's resonated for some time.
Yeah. Well, again, and we'll talk to Chris about this after the break. We got to go to break, but John, Anna just put it perfectly. He's a fighter. Yep. He's fighting for me. Why did somebody vote for Bernie Sanders decide to vote for Donald Trump? He's a fighter, right? He's a fighter. Bobby Kennedy. How in the world could you go from voting for Bobby Kennedy for George Wallace? And it's the same thing, John. A lot of working voters were like, he's going to fight for me. And that is the key. You're fighting for these people's best interest, their self-interest, their family self-interest, to make their lives better.
Yeah, that's arguably the most powerful connection right now in American politics. Ana Georgidis and Mike Allen, thank you both. We really appreciate you being with us.
Mike, happy Friday.
Mike Allen, happy Friday indeed.